Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for so many people turning out this afternoon. Sven tells me there's some parents in the audience, and I hope this talk isn't going to be too depressing for them, because we haven't developed good services for adults with autism as yet. And so the data that I'll be presenting is about cohorts of people who were first diagnosed in the 1970s, 1980s. And really, provision for adults hasn't kept pace with the changes and improvements in provision for children with autism. And I think now is the time. Many years ago, parents of little children had to fight very hard to get diagnosis, to get good provision for the children. And certainly over the years I've been in the field, facilities for children with autism have improved enormously. But there's a lot of catch-up to be done for adults with autism. And I think just as parents all those decades ago and professionals had to fight for better quality of life for children, now I think the fight is on for better quality of life for adults. So I'm going to be talking about what the situation is now, but I would hope that, if I were to give a similar talk in 10 or 20 years' time, the outcome will be much better because of a progress that needs to be made in this field. I think one of the problems is that most research to date on autism has focused on children. Lots of work on improving diagnosis, a lot of intervention research on particularly early programs for children with autism. But of course, autism doesn't disappear when people stop being children. It carries on throughout the lifetime, and people are adults with autism much longer than they are children with autism. A few years ago, the National Autistic Society in the UK tried to alert people to this imbalance in research and understanding of autism, and made the case that we need to be thinking differently about autism. So autism isn't just sort of very sweet little children or adolescents with particular skills. It can be quite elderly people, sometimes living quite lonely lives. And that campaign was started in 2008. But in fact, if one looks at literature developments, even over the years since then, there hasn't been a lot of improvement in the adult field. So, for example, there's been a couple of reviews recently looking at the balance of papers on autism, whether they're child-focused papers or adult-focused papers. And this particular review, I shan't even try to pronounce her name, but they reviewed thousands of publications from the 1940s, when Kanner was first writing about autism, to up to 2 years ago. And you can see there are many thousands of papers overall, but the numbers on adults, the numbers even on adolescents are much smaller than those papers on children, and the numbers on adults smaller still. And if you look for research on older people, and by older people in autism, I'm really talking about studies that have looked at people over the age of 30, the data simply aren't there. And a similar study by Edwards and co-workers, just looking at change over the last couple of years. And you won't be able to read this, I'm afraid, but these are age categories. And these two bars here are for ages 0 to 5 years and 5 to 10 years. So that's where most of the research is being done, in the first 10 years of life. And if you look at papers post-20, again, there's hardly any research at all. And this is telling a similar story, looking at the numbers of participants in each age group, which they reviewed over studies. And you can see there's a big spurt when you look at children, research on children who are around 5, 6 years of age. but thereafter the numbers of the amount of research is really very small. Now, one of the sorry, got missing there. One of the purposes of focusing on very early intervention has been because of the argument that brain is very plastic in the very early years, and if intervention has an impact on brain development, this will have effects on the long-term brain development. But of course, the brain doesn't stop developing at 5. It carries on developing over the next 2 decades at least, and particularly in adolescence, there's huge changes in brain development and complexity. But still, all the intervention research tends to stop in these very early years. So why is it important to be looking more at research on adults? I think one of the main reasons is that what evidence that there is available suggests that outcome is poor and their access to services is much less than it was when people were children. So a recent study in the UK by Terry Brewer and his colleagues has been instrumental actually in being the first epidemiological study looking at prevalence rates in adults. There's loads of studies on prevalence in little children, but actually this is the first systematic study of prevalence in adults. And not surprisingly, the rates in adulthood are similar to the rates in childhood. There's no reason why they shouldn't be, but this had never been done before. But I think the very significant findings here is that as a group, and that includes people with autism of normal IQ, they are very socially disadvantaged. So they're much less likely to be married, they're more likely to be dependent on benefits or living in social housing. Educationally, they're much less well qualified. And despite their particular level of needs, they're generally poorly supported by all services, whether that's social, educational, welfare, health services, and so forth. And because of their reliance on benefits, the facts that they are not able to work, they're not paying taxes, and often their families too are having to give up work to support them, the lifetime costs of autism are very considerable. So a study in the UK some years ago now suggested that the lifetime cost per individual for autism was around £3 million, and that's even for people who don't have intellectual disability, and for people who have autism and intellectual disability, the costs are significantly higher than that. And there's similar sort of estimates in the US as well. Now, I don't want to sort of focus just on the negative aspects because what some of the longer-term research on autism has told us is that there are positive aspects to growing older as well. And one of the very consistent findings in the field is that people show lower, on the whole anyway, show lower levels of autism severity as they grow older. And actually, if you take things like scores on the autism diagnostic interview, a sort of basic diagnostic instrument that looks at autism severity, you find that the general trend is for the scores on that to come down with time, indicating less severe autism symptoms, and only a minority of individuals show a real increase in autism severity over the years. And at more specific levels, you find studies reporting a lessening in things like repetitive and stereotype behaviours, particularly in starting around early to adulthood. Things like social reciprocity tend to improve often from adolescence onwards, particularly in children who don't have intellectual impairments and are able to see for themselves what it is about their behaviour that sets up barriers between them and their typically developing peers, and are able actively to try and change their behaviours in some way to make them more socially acceptable. Now, that if you talk to people with autism, they'll often say this is a huge effort to do, and many of them describe themselves as it's like being on a life is like being on a stage all the time. You're always playing a part. You're playing the part that you think people want you to be. It's not your own yourself, you're not your own real self. So it is a real effort, and people describe it as being very tiring and very stressful at times, but nevertheless they will make this effort to fit in more within society. Also studies record a trend for a decrease in problem behaviours, with quite some follow-up studies showing really quite marked improvements in substantial minorities of the individuals they've followed up. Again, these changes particularly taking place in adolescence. And Canna was one of the first people to comment on this. And he commented particularly on how if people could make use of the special skills they possess, which many people with autism do, that could really open the door to better social integration. So there's a lot to build on there at an individual level. I think the problem comes when you're looking at what society is doing to capitalise on these changes. So if you look at things like rates of employment, for example, these are generally very low, with a number of studies showing rates of paid employment. The numbers of people who are in good paid employment are small, with many people in sheltered workshops or perhaps voluntary work and that sort of thing, but not earning a living. And one of the striking findings is that the provision for daytime activities and so forth is of much lower quality than it was when these individuals were at school. And this is particularly the case for adults of normal IQ. And for them, they are significantly less likely to have an appropriately structured daytime activity than when they were younger, or compared with people who have autism but intellectual impairments as well. So rather paradoxically, it's the people with the, who've got the greatest potential who are having the least offered to them in terms of develop this potential. Some people have suggested that this might just be a blip when people leave school. Change is difficult for people with autism to cope with, and it was suggested that perhaps, once they got over the trauma of leaving school and got used to living in an adult world, things would start to improve. But actually some work by Marcia Seltzer and her colleagues shows very clearly that this isn't a blip. Rates of difficulties and often mental health disturbance increase after school and tend to remain high thereafter. So that certainly people who've looked at mental health problems suggest that there's an increase in mental health diagnoses, and particularly depression and anxiety, and these rates tend to go up in adolescence and carry on through adulthood. So in the US, where I think diagnoses tend to be higher anyway, over half of adults with autism having a diagnosable mental health problem. In the UK, the figures are less, it's around 20-25%. But again, rates of anxiety and depressive disorders being particularly pronounced. And certainly in the States, again, huge increase in medication for people So that a recent study, just a recent survey, suggested that over 60% of adults and almost all, 60% of adolescents and almost all adults were at least on one medication, with nearly 50% of adults actually being given 3 or more different types of medication for a whole range of different reasons. And the other problem is that once people start on medication, they're likely to stay on it, that there isn't proper monitoring and changing of medication or taking people off medication if they find that things haven't worked. Last year, colleague and I published a systematic review of adult outcome studies, and there's also been a study this year in the States looking at what research on adult life is able to tell us. And both these reviews stress the fact that despite all the improvements in intervention and educational programs for children with autism, there's been very few parallel improvements in adult outcomes over the same period of time. So in the review we did, for example, we managed to identify around 20 studies that had followed up individuals from the time they were children to adulthood. The size of them varying quite a lot, but the average size being around 60 to 70. Most of them still focus on fairly young individuals. There's 1 or 2 studies that have people of 50 or 60 years of age, but the average age of the participants in these studies is still quite young. It's only in about the mid-20s. And if you look at the general sort of level of outcome, and a lot of these studies rather crudely have categorized outcome as being good or very good, or moderate, meaning that people are, they can still be rather dependent. They may have a job, but it will be poorly paid, or it may be voluntary. They probably haven't got many outside contacts. And then poor outcome, or very poor, is for people who are very dependent, who don't have any friends, who don't have any outside work, and so forth. So rather crude categories. But nevertheless, the studies quite consistently indicating that numbers of people who can be rated as having a good social outcome in terms of independence and so forth is around 1/5 to 1/4. Around 1/3 are rated as having a fairly good moderate outcome, but actually a substantial minority, almost 50%, really being rated as having a poor outcome. And these figures haven't changed over the years. So what we did in our study, we looked at social outcomes in studies that had been done last century and studies that have been done in the last decade or so. And you can see the rates really haven't changed. So the numbers with a poor outcome remain much the same, a moderately good, fair outcome, or a good outcome. So despite the fact that, from the end of last century onwards, there's been a lot of improvement in child programs, that's not had an impact on adult outcomes. And this figure, which again, I'm afraid you won't be able to read the bottom of, is telling the same sorts of story, but it's looking at different types of outcomes, again, split in the same way. So this is the numbers of people living independently or semi-independently, not changed greatly. Numbers living with parents, staying all the time in the family home has come down a bit, but the numbers in residential care have gone up proportionately. One big change is the numbers of people living in long-term institutional care. The people who were studied in the 60s and 70s, for example, the studies by Michael Rutter or Kanner himself, indicated an awful lot of people after childhood were in long-stay mental institutions, either for people with psychiatric problems or intellectual difficulties. And of course, many of those institutions have closed down anyway, so one's had to find other options. So that's a positive trend. But if you look in terms of the numbers of people in further education or jobs, a bit of improvement, but it's still not great. And the numbers who have long-term relationships or marriages, again, quite small. As Sven alluded to, we've just finished a long-term follow-up study of individuals who we first saw when they're around 6 years of age. We followed them up when they're around 30 years of age, and we've just looked at them again now they're in their mid-40s. Although actually the age range goes from late 20s to mid-60s. This group of individuals is particularly interesting, I think, because they were all assessed as having an IQ, at least a non-verbal IQ, in the normal range when they were children. So obviously, if you've got autism and intellectual disability, then the chances of living independently and working and finding a partner and so forth are much less reduced because of the intellectual disability on top of the autism. But these are people who didn't, as children, show any sign of intellectual disability. And in studies like this, there are difficulties because diagnostic systems change over time, but they were re-diagnosed as time went on using current diagnostic assessments and so forth. We were actually also looking at siblings in this group, but I'm not going to talk about them today. So what happened to these people over the time we saw them? Well, although many of them as children had very limited language, looking at them today, the majority are rated as having some reasonable use of phrase or sentence speech, although it's often at a lower level than you'd expect on the basis of their age and intellectual ability. One of the things that we found was that in children with autism, you tend to get quite a marked disparity between their understanding of language, which is often very low, and their spoken language, particularly in higher ability groups. So they may sound as if they've got a very good vocabulary, perhaps using very sophisticated syntax and words and so forth, but actually their understanding is often very poor, and that leads to all sorts of difficulties. But actually with adulthood, that gap tended to close, so there wasn't that very marked discrepancy between use of vocabulary and understanding. Looking at their employment level, we found that around nearly a third, so 15% in professional jobs and 13% in manual jobs of some kind, so nearly a third were in employment of some kind, but the majority had actually never worked, and the numbers in really high-paid, highly professional jobs were limited. So there were one or two people who were earning a lot of money in scientific types of jobs, computing types of jobs particularly, but they were the minority. And looking at social relationships, about a minority had some friendships, although often the quality of these was less than is usual for people of this age group. But actually over 70% had no specific relationships. And the proportion of people who were married or had close relationships, even of a fairly short duration, again in the minority. And then looking at independent living, again, about 26% either living independently or perhaps living in semi-sheltered accommodation, or in some cases with their parents, but with a high level of autonomy. So they organise their own social outings, their own life generally, even though they were living in a supported environment. So that about a quarter living reasonably independently, but quite a lot of people, and this went for some individuals who were in their mid-60s, living at home with very little autonomy, and the caring falling very much on the parents. And some of our parents were 80 or 90 years of age. And, you know, it wasn't that they were finding difficulties looking after the person with autism. Often after all this time, people develop a, you know, reasonable modus vivendi and they live comfortably together. And often the person with autism was a big help in the house. So it wasn't that there was a sort of physical burden on families, but there was this psychological burden on old, you know, really old parents thinking, well, things are fine now, but what's going to happen when I'm not here anymore to play this role? And then we had about 50% in residential units, either specialist autism or of other kinds. And a very small number of people, actually it was only 2 people, in hospital care. These were people whose level of challenging behaviours was so high that they could not live in the community and needed to be in very specialist environments. I wanted to look in a bit more detail about mental health problems, both from our perspective in this study and more generally, because clearly they can be a problem from adolescence onwards, and it may be the mental health problems that are the biggest barrier to people going out and living independently than the actual autism symptoms. So certainly from, you know, clinical studies from adolescence onwards suggest that rates of anxiety disorders particularly are higher in this group, not only compared with typically developing populations, but people with even conduct disorders or language, developmental language disorders. So several studies, not just of individuals in psychiatric clinics, but people, just general referrals, showing high levels of psychopathology in young children. And in adults, again, the data suggesting high levels of anxiety, and sometimes delusional beliefs, but often to do with the sort of anxiety they have, particularly in dealing in social contexts. Depressive problems. The one sort of area of mental health difficulties that doesn't seem to be particularly raised in this group is rates of schizophrenia, which seem to be no higher and possibly even somewhat lower in this population than in the general population. Fred Volkmar, some years ago now, found that the rate was very similar or somewhat less to the general population. And if one looks at reports, these are just case reports, it's not a systematic study of psychiatric diagnoses in adults of autism. You can't read this, I'm afraid, but the red bar indicates the proportion of individuals who've got affective types of disorders, anxiety and depression. Rates of other disorders fairly low. One condition where the rates may be rather higher than you'd expect is in catatonia, or what's been described as catatonia. I mean, this is a sort of condition that used to be seen in long-stay mental health hospitals years ago, before better drugs came into use, but it sort of disappeared from the reports in the literature a great deal. But actually, Lorna Wing, some couple of decades ago, and other people have noted quite surprisingly higher rates of catatonic types of symptoms in people with autism. Other people have suggested they're probably just a combination of depression and sort of motor difficulties that are common in autism, although that's still out for debate. There's also been a suggestion that people of higher intelligence with autism may be more prone to mental health problems than people with autism and low IQ, because they're much more able to see the difference between themselves and other people and how their despite all their efforts, they achieve much less. But in fact, although the data aren't great, they suggest that the rates are very similar, whether you've got just autism or a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome or high-functioning autism. So the profiles are really very similar. One of the problems in assessing rates of mental health problems, and I think one of the reasons why the rates in some studies are much higher than the rates in others, are that one of the problems is that who do you get the information from? If you get the information from parents, they may not have a real sort of insight into their son's or daughter's mental health, and yet people with autism themselves are typically poor at reporting on their own mental states and their own feelings and so forth. So it is quite an issue there. In the study that we've just finished, we actually relied more on what informants, i.e. parents or sometimes siblings, told us, because of the relatively small numbers of people who were able really to respond to sort of standard psychiatric rating interviews and so forth. On the other hand, we did find quite a high correlation amongst those people who could report on their own mental state. There was a high correlation between what they told us and what their parents were telling us. So I think parent reports aren't infallible, but they give a reasonable impression of how people are functioning. And actually in this study we found rather lower rates than one might have expected on the basis of some of the children's studies, which show very high rates of the mental health problems we've found. So that so these are the numbers of people. So about 20, the red bars are the people who actually required treatment, though there are other people who had troublesome symptoms, though not having treatment. So quite about a quarter were actually having or had some treatment for depression, and again around 20% treatment for anxiety, and a smaller number had treatment for OCD type problems over and above the ritualistic types of problems you get in autism, although more people reported having problems with OCD type symptoms than were actually treated. So that was based on parent report. If you look at self-report, on a general sort of questionnaire, the general health questionnaire, actually about 40% felt they had difficulties of some sort with mental health problems. But more specific questionnaires, say on OCD or depression or anxiety, or a questionnaire we had on ADHD, they were around 10% in those areas, but actually more people reporting symptoms similar to OCD, where they felt they really weren't in control of the difficulties. And in another study on mental health problems, so it's rather mixed rates of the numbers of people actually getting treated are probably around 20-25%, although more people report difficulties than are actually being treated. And another study also done with colleagues at the Maudsley, although this was a wider IQ group of 135 adults, again followed through from childhood. Around 16% of those individuals had a definite diagnosable new psychiatric disorder in adulthood, and around 6% had clearly new problems, although they were difficult to fit into any sort of clear diagnostic category. And the sorts of difficulties reported in that study were this combination of OCD-type problems and catatonia, and the rest were generally affective disorders or depression. Again, no cases of schizophrenia there. With the onset generally either being in the late teens or in the early 20s. And a lot of the people who did show an onset of new disorders in adulthood or in adolescence, these difficulties actually being related to environmental stresses, trying to get a job, losing a job, moving residence, and so forth. And again, in that study, there wasn't any association with IQ, so these problems affected people of normal IQ just as much as they did people of lower intellectual ability. So I think one of the, so overall, when there's been very systematic and careful assessment of mental health problems in adulthood, the rates tend to be around 20-25%, whereas some of the recent reports of psychopathology in children have suggested rates of up to 70%. I think one of the problems there is that the measures of mental health problems in children often include behavioural problems as well as emotional problems. And if you take those out of the picture, you tend to find rather lower levels of real psychiatric problems. And there's a number of other recent adult studies that have also suggested the rates are probably around 25% or so. So, you know, a significant problem and a significant challenge to mental health services for adults, but perhaps not quite such a gloomy picture as has been suggested in the past. One of the things we were able to do with our study, because we were sort of following, we saw the people as children and then again as young adults and then older adults, was look at whether they'd made improvements over the adult years as well as in the, you know, the much longer gap from child to adulthood. One of the things we found was very little change in IQ over time. So actually, a childhood IQ was a very good predictor of what intellectual level would be later on. There are a few people who made big changes in IQ, particularly verbal IQ over time, and a few individuals who showed a decline in cognitive ability. But the overwhelming picture was for stability in IQ. The other positive finding was changes in symptomatology over time. So this is the autism diagnostic interview that was given when diagnosis was first confirmed, once that came out, and then looking at change to the last assessment where we used the ADIR. And you can see, even if you can't read the bottom bit, the numbers meeting criteria on all three domains of the ADI had come down, with more people actually just meeting criteria on two domains. Their total score on the ADI had come down, and their scores on for communication impairments, social impairments, and repetitive behaviours had all come down. So improvements, stability in IQ, which reflects increases in many aspects of ability over time, improvements in symptomatology, but actually not much improvement in terms of independent living, work and relationships and so forth. So very little change in the numbers at work. And so if people had got a job by the time they were in their mid-20s to 30s, they tended to keep that job. But there were very few people who went on and found work subsequently. Fewer people living with their parents, and some people living more independently, though which was positive. But actually there were some people who had fewer friends in older adulthood than they had in younger adulthood. Sometimes because they had, when we first saw them as adults, they'd got friends from perhaps still from school or possibly from college, but over the time they'd lost contacts with these people who'd then gone on and married and had families of their own. So there was less sort of, common interest between them. The numbers in who'd married had gone up slightly or developed close relationships, but on the whole, little change over adulthood. So it seemed that, you know, it's really important to get people into work and help them with independent living in the early years of adulthood, because then that's likely to persist. But if they don't have those opportunities, then the chances as they get older, as with anybody, I guess, of then finding work is going to be less. I mentioned that although IQ had generally remained stable, there was a small number of people who seemed to show a decline in cognitive ability over time. And they tended to be the people who remained very impaired in terms of their verbal ability. So as children, they hadn't been able to score on verbal IQ tests, though they were good on non-verbal IQ tests, and these severe deficits in language persisted after childhood. They also had very poor social skills in childhood, and also the people who showed a marked decline in IQ tended to be people who developed quite severe behavioural problems over time as well. And the two people we had who were in long-term hospital care, for example, had also shown a very marked decline in IQ. It also seemed that gender played a role in that a decline in IQ was more common in the women in our group than in the men, but we had a very small number of females, so it's difficult to extrapolate from that. But they're really only statistical indicators, and if you look at, you know, individual trajectories, it was very difficult to predict on an individual level how well people would do. So just as a sort of illustration there, we had two individuals who, when we first saw them, looked very similar, but who had very different trajectories over time. This particular man I remembered very well as a child. He's now in his mid-50s. He was one of the most difficult individuals I'd seen for a long time. He was impossible to interview because he wouldn't answer any of the psychiatrist's questions unless the psychiatrist wrote all the questions down on a blackboard at that time. His behaviour was totally uncontrollable at home, and he was so difficult that he actually was treated as an inpatient for some time because of the severity of his autistic behaviours. But he then, his behaviours did improve. He went to a school initially for children with intellectual disabilities because it was thought that he'd got really very little academic potential. But actually, as his behaviour settled, people became aware of his intellectual abilities. He then moved into mainstream school. He went on to university, got a master's degree. He's always been employed. He's been married in the past. And he's got a huge number of colleagues and friends. He's a very good musician, gives concerts to, locally and that sort of thing. And is one of these people who, on paper look as if they've done extremely well in life, and in many ways he has, although he's still clearly autistic if you meet him. But he's done very well despite the fact that he's just one of these people you remember because he was so awful as a child, so difficult. And it's so good to see somebody, just totally transformed. Whereas this other person, a woman, similar IQ when she was younger, but actually now we couldn't test her directly. The only information we could get on her was informant report on the Vineland because she just could not attend to direct testing. She never needed hospital treatment. She was educated in specialist autism provision, and since adulthood she's always lived in a private residential home. She really has no autonomy, never worked, no friends. And if you'd gone back and looked at them, videos of them in the past, you would say, well, she was the one who was going to do well, and he would always need special care, and it's actually totally the other way around. So she's an example of one of the women we had in the cohort who did very poorly. And other studies have suggested poorer outcomes for women. But of course, there are lots of exceptions there. And, you know, there's lots of women who've made, well, not lots, but, you know, significant number who've made a very good living as autistic adults who are, that's Temple Grandin, Wendy Lawson, an Australian woman who's a fantastic lecturer now about, you know, the problems of living with autism, Donna Williams, Gunilla Gernhard, and a whole variety of people one could pick up on. One of the suggestions from the people who are, you know, very sort of strong on early intervention is that you need early intervention to have a good outcome. But again, there's very little evidence for that. And there's some a nice article recently in the American press, just going back to the first case that was described by Canna, and he was called Donald T. I've forgotten what the T stands for, but anyway, he came from a small town in the States, and somebody tracked him down, a journalist tracked him down last year to see what was happening to him. And this is Donald T, who's now, I think, 77 years of age. And he was the first, was born in Forest Hill, Mississippi, still lives in Forest Hill, Mississippi, and that's him with his brother. But who's made a lot of progress, was in a institution, so he was placed in institutional care at the age of 3 because he was so difficult. Later on, returned home to live with his parents, although he was described by his mother at that time as hopelessly insane because of his difficulties. He had very little special help while growing up, but he carried on to live in the family home as he became easier to cope with. So say he's now 77, he still lives in the same house that he was in when he was diagnosed, but he lives independently, drives his own car, he's got a fascination with registration plates apparently, plays golf every day. His speech is described as very repetitive, so he says the same things in the same way to the people he plays with, but other people are perfectly happy to partner him, and he's seen as a sort of character in his hometown. So a nice story of somebody who never had any help, and again, who, you know, on paper looked as if he would have a very poor outcome, but has done extremely well. So not having early intervention doesn't mean you're not going to have a good outcome. But I think we need to look at why there is an onset of problems in adulthood for those people who do find life more difficult. I think there's good evidence that the causes are often environmental, so often linked to stressors, perhaps dealing with college or university life, looking for employment, particularly the lack of structure when people leave school. And the usual disturbances of home life as people grow older, or in residential care for people who are placed in special provision. So, you know, family members dying, residential staff leaving, and that sort of thing. And what one finds is that, particularly in higher ability groups, although IQ is an important indicator if you take autism across the board, if you just take individuals who are of normal intellectual ability, the outcome for those people seems to be related much more to the support provision they receive in adulthood than things like IQ. But, as I say, for most adults of normal intellectual ability, there's no special provision. They don't meet criteria for mental health services, they don't meet criteria for intellectual disability services because their IQ is in the normal range. And really, there's nobody and nothing out there really offering specific support. And the support networks, not just for them, but also their parents, are much less than they were when they were children. So it's not only the people with autism who are disadvantaged, their families are as well in terms of the help that's given. And I think a good illustration of the importance of social networks is given by this study by Meg Farley and her colleagues, carried out a couple of years ago in the States. And she had a group of people who were similar sort of IQ level to ours, but actually they were all doing much better in terms of their adult lives. So nearly 40% had gone through college, nearly 30% in full-time work, over 50% having friendships, more people in close sexual relationships or married or children of their own, and over a quarter living independently. So, you know, what was it about this cohort that was different? And I think the difference was they all lived in Salt Lake City, and they all belonged to the Mormon Church. And of course, that's a sort of very much a cradle-to-grave society, I mean, unusual society to say the least, but nevertheless very supportive, and also supportive of people who are different in some sort of way. And with that sort of level of support, people able to achieve better outcomes than in the majority of studies. So, I mean, even in that study, there's still, you know, the majority of people were quite dependent. But I think it illustrates how a good support network can have an impact. And unfortunately, that's not been the situation amongst the people we've been looking at. And we're particularly concerned about the impact on families, because we really felt that the parents are a hidden army of carers, really. Certainly in the UK, I don't know what it's like elsewhere, but often both they and their sons or daughters are unknown to social services because they've done a good job in supporting over the years. But, you know, we've got people like this 80-year-old mother and another single father who was 90, just wondering what was going to happen when they weren't around or anymore. And then siblings wondering, you know, what impact it would have on their lives and their families if their parents had died. And, you know, one sad tale we had of a sister of a 50-year-old whose mother had, she developed Alzheimer's. She was now in a care home herself, and he just couldn't understand this at all. He used to go to the care home every day to ask her to tell him what he should get for his dinner and what clothes he should wear and everything. The staff in the home didn't understand him. They got very irritated by him coming in and being disruptive, and he upset his mother, she upset him, and they were trying to ban him from going into the home because of his behaviour. So really a sad story there, but very much to do with the lack of support. So trying to give a more sort of positive aspect on things now, I'm just going to look at what I think we should be doing to make things better for the next groups of people coming through as adults with autism. We obviously need to be supporting networks and the sort of quality of life we can be giving people, because if we don't do this, we risk individuals not being able to make the best of their skills. Many people, particularly in the normal IQ range, have got specific skills in computing or science or whatever, that with the right sort of guidance, finding the right niche in life, can lead to very good outcomes. Now, so, I mean, Temple Grandin didn't get much help, but she'd got skills that she could use extremely well. And there are some quite positive books now out about people who may or may not have had autism or Asperger's syndrome, who, because of their very special skills, have done very well in life. I think we can also, a lack of support also means that individuals who've got special skills are not only helped not to develop them, but can also get into trouble because of those skills. And we've had this case recently of Gary McEwen, a guy who hacked into the computer system of the Pentagon, I think on a dial-up connection of all things, But, you know, instead of the states wanting to hire him instantly as, you know, to deal with their communication problems, they wanted him extradited for spying, and he's only just been reprieved from being sent over there. So I think we need to be improving support networks. We need to be trying to help people develop useful social skills that have a real impact on their lives. I think the social skills programs that we sort of run at the moment, they're pretty sort of crude, really. You do find generalization to tasks within the same domain or the same setting where these are taught, but generally little generalization to other domains. So you can teach people social skills in a nice protective social skills setting, but whether this really helps them cope in real life, the evidence for that just isn't there. And I think, you know, we tend to sort of have, most social skills groups, certainly in the UK, they're run by lady therapists for adolescent boys. So we teach them all sorts of things that as women therapists, we would like men to be. But of course, men aren't like that. And really, you need to teach them not politeness, but, you know, how to look right, apart from anything else, and how to act right in social situations. And I had one person who was very critical of social skills groups, particularly as, you know, say, yours may be better than the UK ones. But he said we were teaching completely ridiculous things. He's a collector of obscure road signs. He collects anything that's totally sort of, you know, impossible to understand. I mean, what this one here is, I don't know. Or what you're supposed to do to avoid that. And he takes a delight in quizzing you and saying, well, what does that one mean and what does that one mean? But he used these as an example, and he says, for him, understanding the rules of social interaction were as difficult as it is for us to understand things like that. And he said, unless you can teach me the subtleties of your social world, so you can understand them, so I can understand them in a way I could teach you to understand these signs, I really don't think much of your programs. I think because of mental health difficulties, we need to be looking at how we can improve programs for mental health. CBT, for example, there's a growing number of trials there, but in very different types of strategies, and usually not being used with clinically referred cases. They're children or adolescents who may have problems, but they're not the sort of really severe problems you tend to see in psychiatric clinics. And the measures, they tend to be analog measures, not measures of real life functioning. As I say, they're not clinically referred cases, and the follow-ups are generally short term. And also using a big range of interventions, so we really don't know which works best. I think with CBT as well, certainly with children, it's very evident that it's no good doing CBT on a one-to-one basis with the psychiatrist or psychologist or whoever and the client with autism. You've got to involve families who can sort of have an impact and make sure homework and tasks are done every day. Just coming in once a week for CBT is unlikely to have any real impact. And then I think we need to be much more funding for long-term interventions that are going to have an impact on whole lifestyle. So, for example, many people fail to get employment even though they've got the skills to do so. And some years ago, I was involved in setting up a supported employment scheme with the National Autistic Society in the UK. And although this was hard to get off the ground and took quite a long time to get people into work to begin with, once we'd persuaded companies that it was good to employ people with autism because, you know, they don't stand around gossiping all the time. They're terribly honest in work, and they'll do routine tasks that other people may get fed up with. They can be really good employees. After the initial sort of stages, we managed to get a good number of people in work, and more importantly, they were doing jobs, you know, computing, technical types of jobs that suited their educational background. On the other hand, I think although getting people into work is important, we need to be cautious about imposing what our views of a good quality life is, of people, on people with autism who may have a very different view of what a good quality of life is. They may not want friends. They may not feel that they can work full time. They may find, you know, living by themselves, or actually in some cases in a group home, is what they want. So one does need to be cautious in imposing, you know, one's own point of view on other people. And there's been, you know, more work on this recently, and some of the work carried out here on these sort of person-environment fit models. So you're not wanting the same sort of outcomes for everybody, but you're looking at outcomes and sort of things like daily programs, sort of and opportunities for activities generally that suit that particular person. And that may be, if you do that, rather than doing really what we've done, which is focus on the usual things like living independently, work, and have you got friends, that may, I think, give a rather more positive picture than that approach may give a rather more positive picture. So really, just to conclude, I think, although I hope I've not been too gloomy as I say, because I think at an individual level, we've got a lot of positives to go on, that there's clear evidence in most cases of improvement, gains in skills, decreases in autism severity, and so forth. The problem is that at a societal level, there's really been a failure to offer people the environment they need to capitalise on these opportunities for change and development. And I think that really no matter how good or how widely accessible diagnostic and intervention services for very young children become, unless education, health and social and any other services, unless they improve for older individuals, the outcome for many adults will not be very positive. And I think there's a very useful review by Joe Piven and his colleagues last year. They set up a working party because of their realization of the lack of research on adults, and stressing the need for systematic studies on the characteristics associated with aging in autism, and looking for potential interventions, both at an individual and at a society level, that can improve outcome and quality of life. And I think that if the advances in comprehensive treatment programs that have happened for very young children can now be applied across the lifespan, then hopefully children with autism now growing up may face a much more positive future. So thank you.